Today's session, a very interesting topic we've identified as we begin this year's programming. We're going to look at the fundamentals of good governance. The fundamentals of good governance. Now, I dare say to you that I believe strongly, as Maxwell says, that everything rises or falls on leadership. Leadership is critical. Leadership at the level of government, at the level of the country, at the level of the firm, leadership even at the level of the family. Leadership is critical. And so we must understand the significance of governance, the um, fundamentals of managing and governing well. And so we thought we would begin this year with such a focus. I want to suggest to you that the speaker that I'm going to introduce momentarily is well versed, well competent to address this topic for us and to give us some insights as business owners, as managers of organizations, how we should approach the issue of governance. What really is governance? What is required of us to make sure that we can govern and govern well? So, as I said, we're dealing with the fundamentals of good governance. It is my pleasure to share a little bit about our presenter this morning. Erica K. Smith has worked in business development, the creative industries, governance, and intellectual property for over 20 years. And during this time, she's focused on developing countries and has done consultancies and presentations throughout the CARIFORUM region, as far as Greece as well, Germany, Mexico, Brazil, and the like. She has undergraduate degrees in law and management, a master's of science degree in international business. She also holds a master's of law degree in intellectual property law and a master's of law degree in international sports law and management. So you appreciate that she's very well versed and competent. She undertook her doctoral studies at the University of Agder in Norway, and her research focused on the role of collective management in small economies in the digital environment. Dr. Smith has authored various business management and copyright courses and is a head tutor with the World Intellectual Property Office Academy. I'll also share with you that her work has covered business development and intellectual property strategies at the national and organizational level. And some of the sectors that she's worked in include fashion, music, science and technology, animation, film, information communications technology, and sports. She's a member of the National Intellectual Property Committee of Barbados since about 2004, and she's also the secretary of the board of directors of the Small Business Association of Barbados and a member of the Caribbean Corporate Governance Institute. So, ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to introduce to you this morning Dr. Erica Smith, who will share with us on this very critical topic of fundamentals of good governance. Dr. Smith, over to you.
Good morning. Thank you. And thank you to all of the participants in today's session. As the title said, it's a introductory session. Um, so I will begin by sharing my screen. So, 1 second. Oh. Okay. Sorry. So first, let me just explain how today's session is organized. I'll do an introduction, giving a little background, is understood by corporate governance, and then we're going to try to apply that to SMEs. I've tailored the presentation specifically for the small business sector. I will make a few recommendations, and then I'll open up to question and answers. So I'll start with a premise and try to use this as the context for why this subject is important for small businesses. And the premise is that with poor governance, the sustainability of small businesses is threatened. Or a positive impact, I should say, in terms of strategy and strategic direction, decision-making, the branding of the organization, and organizational credibility. So this seeks to explain why you should be considering governance and the good governance of your organizations. So what are we talking about? Well, the word governance can speak to many things, but we'll zone in from a business perspective. So corporate governance. And a very simple explanation is that it is a system by which comes one definition. And another is that corporate governance is about promoting corporate fairness, transparency, and accountability. So from these definitions, you should understand that corporate governance is a function, right? It's concerning things you do. So I just placed this graphic to very broadly give an idea as to all the different aspects that could be covered under the rubric of corporate governance. We will go through some of these today. So, as I said, we're talking about functions and there are reasons why you focus on having good governance, good corporate governance. So first of all, you want to ensure that there's an effective framework for the implementation of good corporate governance. And we'll talk about what that means. You have to consider the rights of, if you have shareholders and key ownership functions. I know that many of you will be sole proprietorship, so don't worry, we will make this all relevant. Where you do have shareholders or multiple owners, you have to consider how are you going to treat all categories of owners equitably or fairly. And this is particularly important in membership organizations where the members constitute the owners. You have to consider the role of stakeholders in terms of corporate governance. And stakeholders go beyond owners. They include employees, suppliers, customers, some generally the general public. So stakeholders can be, you're considering disclosure and transparency. As we will see, this is especially important for small businesses when you are seeking external financing. And importantly, and I think this is the area that concerns a lot of people. It speaks to the responsibilities and indeed the role of the board of directors. Now, those points concerning corporate governance, let's understand a bit of history. So the subject really began to be researched in the 1930s when there was a focus on understanding the firm. What is a firm? Why do firms exist? And looking at the expansion and growth of firms, so international. And what would happen is you normally would have a company starts with a founder, with one or two persons. And as it grows, you have to, and to support expansion, you have to invite in investors, shareholders, etc. So what happens is the company has to then, as it expands, employ professionals, professional management. And you see a separation between the owners and management. And what happens? Management has to be held accountable to owners to ensure that they are fulfilling the objectives of the organization, the company, and acting in the best interests of the owners and not simply enriching themselves. So you had to establish systems to ensure that accountability by management. And what that means is you have the owners, and the owners delegate responsibilities to a board of directors who represent their interests. The board of directors exists to implement policy of the organization or the firm. But the board of directors, and we're talking in terms of larger organizations, so the board of directors would not generally be involved in the day-to-day management. Rather, they will engage a CEO and in turn delegate some of their responsibility to the CEO. So the CEO is then responsible for the implementation of the policy that was set by the board and the day-to-day running of the organization. So you see that delegation from members to the board of directors, to the CEO, and then you have the employees of the organization. But that created distance. So, you know, the supervisor in the factory somewhere, how is he or she being held responsible to the owners? And in the case of a company where they're shareholders, we could be talking hundreds of thousands of people, of individuals, of institutional investors, etc. So there was what is known as an agency problem, where you had to, as I said, develop systems to ensure that accountability right back to the owners. So control, because as you move from the founders of the company to all of these many shareholders, there is some loss of control. And as I said, accountability, monitoring, and reporting. So you have to establish systems to address all of these. Now, the challenge has been that all of the research and thought in this area, as I said, originally developed concerning very large organizations and organizations primarily located in the United States, in Europe, the developed world. There has been very little work done in terms of developing countries and in terms of the SIDS. Obviously, the reality is that there are lots of small organizations and different types of organizations which would have governance issues. And what we've seen over time is the expansion of the topic to nonprofit organizations. So you have a whole field that concerns nonprofits, SMEs, which is the focus of today's discussion. And you even see governance being broken down into functional areas. So you would have IT governance, intellectual property governance, innovation governance, etc. So the recognition is that governance issues are extremely important and have to be considered at different levels. As I mentioned in my introduction, there's also specific areas concerning the governance of membership organizations and associations. I'm not going to speak a lot about those today, but what I will say is that underlying all of these different entities and their concerns, whilst they're specific issues, the fundamental principles apply. So I don't know the background of the audience, but even if you are here, you're with an association, a sports organization, for example, the key principles will still apply. So looking at it specifically in terms of SMEs, these organizations are characterized generally as being sole proprietorships. So you might have one owner, maybe two people. You have few employees, and often these can be relatives of the owner. So a subset of this would be the family company. And you have to consider things like the impact of culture. So the not only the culture of the owners, but the culture of the environment you're operating in. So the operating environment, education, and I thought about, should I include this point or not? So it's not to say that you have to have a specific level of education, not at all, but it is to acknowledge that generally most people will only have expertise, knowledge, skills, etc., in a specific area. So generally, when you establish an organization, you will be working in a field that you are familiar with and you have some experience in. So it can be a limiting factor. The type of business will also have an impact in terms of how the company or the organization is characterized. So at least in the initial stages, any separation between the owners and management, they're usually one and the same. The idea of a board of directors, a lot of SMEs will not have a board of directors. And due to the regulatory framework. So, for example, in Barbados, you aren't subject to financial audits until you reach a certain or substantial level of revenue. So, you have less disclosure requirements. You don't need to feed information to shareholders and the public, et cetera, et cetera. So, based on these characteristics, you would see that what I referred to previously as an agency problem, where you have managers acting as agents on behalf, managers and board of directors acting as agents on behalf of the owners, that would not generally exist for SMEs. Having said that, there's some things we need to think about. So within your small organization, how are decisions made? On what basis? What information do you use to make decisions? Are you regularly having financial reports? Do you have budgets? Do you have targets? Are you reading the business news to get an understanding of what may happen in the future that would affect your business? How are you making decisions? How do you know what you should be doing with the business? So often you will speak to small business owners and entrepreneurs, and they'll say, well, I will be expanding. I want to expand to throughout the Caribbean in the next 5 years. Okay. But how have you made that determination? Is it that you think that's what you should do? Is there scope for the business internationally? How do you know what you should do? How do you know what level of inventory you should maintain? And where does the knowledge in your organization come from? And the skills, are these all primarily with the owner? Is there an employee who really is the backbone of the organization? Where is this knowledge, where are the skills coming from? And you need to understand this, not only for governance purposes, but you need to understand how do you secure these skills and this knowledge? How are you able to extract the knowledge effectively in the organization? When we go into the question and answer segment, it would be interesting if you could give me some responses to these questions. How do you identify and manage business risk within your company, your organization? What are the key risks now, in 2 years, in 5 years? How do you plan to address these? This second question is similar to one before, but how do you obtain and where do you obtain information on the performance of your business? And this becomes a challenge normally when you want to go and get financing, because then you have to have your business plan, you have to have financials. And taking that a step further, how do you know how it was performing 6 months ago, 6 years ago? So these are the sort of questions that you as business owners have to be able to answer. And it is by having an effective governance structure in place that you will be greatly assisted in terms of being able to respond to these. Now, in terms of small businesses, there are a number of specific challenges. As I said, normally these businesses start with a founder. And there's a question of, what happens after suppose the founder, God forbid, passes away next week, what happens? Suppose the founder becomes very ill or incapacitated for whatever reason. What happens with the business? And I'm sure you would have heard about succession planning. And this is a challenge for small businesses, and it considers the next one, which is the roles of family members. Because we, at least in Barbados, an issue we have is the continuation of small businesses past one generation. And we definitely have some shortcomings in that regard. And why? It's because really there's no planning to move off from the founder. So, as I said in a previous slide, often the employees may be family members. And understanding how family members are groomed to take over the business and whether they in fact should take over the business. Understanding the skill set of family members. So why do you have family members involved in the business? Oh, I want this. I'm doing this for my family, so I want them involved. It's a matter of trust. I want to make sure I have people around me I can trust. And these are not, these are quite legitimate reasons. But as we go through the slides, we'll have to consider as you move from one stage to the next, how do you address these issues and what roles can family members or should family members continue to play? Then you have a situation where you may have not only family members employed, but you may have other owners and or stakeholders involved in the business. And stakeholders here could be investors. They may not have an ownership interest, but they may have invested in the business. And I'm sure you all know of situations where the family members have their ideas of how things should be done or their own interests that they're trying to protect, which may work against the interests of other owners in the business or stakeholders. So decision making or oversight. And I think you would have recognized this as a challenge based on the questions I was asking before. But making some decisions is a challenge of SMEs, associations, and sports organizations and membership organizations. Decision making is a challenge generally, and ensuring good oversight. So, what research has shown is that one of the concerns as far as oversight is concerned, especially with family-owned businesses, is that you tend to have a high level of theft and fraud. So the idea that having family members helps to build trust or allows you to have a certain level of trust is one thing. In fact, they can be the source of a lot of problems. The recruitment of qualified management. So, and I keep going back to the family-owned business because that proliferates in our environment. But but as the organization grows or is properly established, you have to think in terms of relinquishing some of that control and bringing in qualified persons, qualified management, qualified employees. Some resistance to that. We'll talk about why that there's this resistance. The weak internal controls, that speaks to point number 4. And the point I've been making for pretty much the entire presentation now, the need to have good reporting, accounts, and systems in place to allow you to know what's really going on with the business. The need to access external finance. This, of course, is an issue for many small businesses. And you'll often hear them say, oh, it's so difficult for small businesses to access finance and etc. There are actually quite a few sources of external financing for small businesses. Not that there are no challenges in terms of the provision of financing, because there still are. But a lot of times, challenges that the small businesses have no information or structure or anything, so they don't qualify. And finally, and this is one of the shortcomings as in terms of governance theories generally, is that small businesses are very dynamic and are subject to a lot of change. They're affected a lot by the external environment. So you need to have systems that reflect that dynamism within the organization. So these are some of the challenges. Maybe you have some more to add, or maybe you will want to discuss some in more detail. But it is against this background that we consider governance in SMEs. So, as I mentioned, what happens is you start off normally with a single person or a few people, but hopefully the business will grow over time. And it is with that growth that you have a number of challenges. And this is nothing unique to our environment. If you think of some of the what are some of the most successful companies ever. So Facebook, Tesla, Apple. These organizations have all faced and continue to face challenges moving from the original founder or founders to large organizations and understanding the role of the original founder and how to adjust to these changes. And in some instances, the founders have been absolutely reluctant to relinquish control. So you see them, they would have been there as chairman of the board and CEO. We'll talk about that. And they exert from the time they have to access external financing, so they go on, they become public and issue shares, etc. the dynamics change and they're forced to change the structure, the governance, the structure of the organization. And that concerns very large organizations, but it's also applicable to SMEs. So again, you start with a small team where everyone is multitasking. You generally will have informal systems and an ad hoc approach to things. Most of the decision making, if not all, is done by the founder who is fully involved in the business. With growth, you have a larger team. You should have increased professionalization. You should have the development of your internal systems. You certainly should have moved off of an ad hoc approach. So right now you have the systems which would allow for the provision of information, reports, monitoring, etc., so that you can make sound decisions. You have decentralization and an expansion of ownership and investors. So you have the movement away from the founder slash owner. And I personally think that's where a lot of the issues arise. Because as the organization grows, you have to consider, do we need to have, and especially when you bring in investors, external investors, do we need to have a board of directors established? Maybe, maybe not. Depending on how your organization is structured and the type of organization, you may want to have some advisors. Whether it's a board of directors or some advisors, you want to ensure that they bring certain competencies. So I very, very much promote competency-based boards. You want to identify people not because they're your friends or family, or because they're well known. You want to ensure that you have persons who have the skills and knowledge that can help move your organization forward, who can help you to develop good policy, who are strategic. So you have to think in terms of what competence does that person bring to the organization. And if we think in terms of members organization, and this is a little tricky because of course the SBA is a members organization. And for those of you who know me, you would know that I work with a members organization. But the reality is often these entities are set up so that once you're elected, you're a member and you're elected to be a director, that's it. So you become a director of an organization, you feel really proud, you know. You may have none of the skill sets the organization really needs. And the thing is, people tend to be quick to accept directorships and not stop to think, well, what can I offer this organization? What will I bring to the organization? So remember I said you have the board of directors, and the board of directors is led by a chairman or a chairwoman, chairperson. Sometimes the chair is also the CEO. I can tell you that is not considered good practice. And certainly, if you look at, let's say in the UK, um, their codes of practice, etc., which actively discourage that. And why? It's because the directors and the CEO have to operate with a certain level of independence and objectivity. And when you have a director, and directors are often owners. So when you have an owner who's also managing, fine, with a small organization, that happens. But when you need to make big decisions and operate professionally, um, it becomes a challenge having a CEO who's also the chair. You have to, so we consider the chair, the directors, the CEO. I think it should go without saying that you want someone who is a professional and has the relevant skills and experience to properly run the organization. Directors, and especially where, remember I mentioned about possible conflicts with family members and other stakeholders. So imagine where directors are involved in management. That's a no-no. And that's something that I think we have a hard time understanding. The directors are there to establish policy. Management is there to act in a professional and objective manner to ensure the policy is implemented, to oversee the staff, and they are held accountable um, by having to report to the board of directors. And if the board of directors feels that they're not really being kept in the loop, etc., then it speaks to establishing good systems for monitoring and control. But no CEO and chairman being one and the same, at least insofar as it can be avoided. And again, just look at best practice around the world. Even if it starts like that, eventually you see movement away. No directors managing, and family members need to understand their role. Excuse me one moment. Now, as the organization grows, you have to constantly review and restructure to suit because your needs will change. So we saw how we go from the sole proprietorship with the one guy who's doing everything. And as the organization grows, the need to implement these systems. And essentially, what I've just gone through in a very introductory manner, because it's an introductory session, are the principles of good governance and the considerations for SMEs. And that is today's presentation. I will now open the session to questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Smith, for your presentation. Let us at this time invite our participants to pose their questions, their comments, and so on. I have a question coming from Eves all the way in Europe. And the question is, beyond the challenges, is there a simple toolbox for, that it means SMEs? Beyond the challenges, Dr. Smith,
Yes,
is there a simple toolbox for SMEs?
there, in terms of toolboxes, there are some that have been established by different organizations, which provide simple guidelines. I can send this to the SBA to post after, but there is a particularly good one out of, I think it's out of Canada. And then there's also a simple one out of Kenya, but there are some simple toolboxes that I can make available.
Okay, thank you very much. So we
Any
look
other
forward to
questions?
receiving those tools that we can also post up on the website and send out to members for their information. As you were speaking, the thought came to mind that many of our small businesses, because our audience is primarily small firms, medium firms, they tend not to have an appreciation for a board of directors. And I heard you mention in the presentation, but small businesses might not have a board of directors. But shouldn't we seek to encourage that for the growth of the firm, after we've moved away from becoming from being a sole proprietor and we've incorporated, that for the growth of the firm, the ability to attract the competencies needed to help govern and direct the organization, that we really should be encouraging our small firms to set up a board of directors, even if we begin with a small board of, say, 3 persons, but to thrive, to put that in place as a criterion for the growth and development of the enterprise.
Yes, and in that regard, I spoke to, even if you don't call it a board of directors, advisors. So if you at least have a few independent advisors, I think that would be useful. So yeah, it may not be an actual board, but at least to have some independent advisors.
Mhm. All right, I
So I
see a
definitely
question
agree.
here. Yes, from Sharon Holder. Can executive directors be employed to further provide insight as to the day-to-day operations of the business?
Yes, you can have executive directors. Um, but actually, what I prefer is if you have external directors. So persons who are totally outside of the business who come in because of their expertise. So in the case of, for example, a members organization where it may be required that the directors are comprised members, um, I still think there should be room to allow in external expertise. But you can have executive directors, especially, for example, where you still have the transition of a small entity and the founder. It may still be useful, for example, for the founder to be engaged actively in the day-to-day running of the organization because of their specific skills, experience, etc. But what you will need to have is a system that allows So yes, you can still make use of executive directors.
Mm. I think that following on from this question, Dr. Smith, you'll agree with me that
Mhm.
many of the large corporations that we look to for best practice and guidance, many of them, their boards comprise uh, executive directors, if you will. Their boards comprise, director of finance, director of HR, and so on. And these are operational functions, and yet they serve on the board.
This is a problem in our environment.
Mhm.
And I am convinced is why we have certain limitations in how far our companies go. And there is a challenge when you have those sorts of titles and roles allocated to directors, then you make it really messy separating management from directors. So you may have an executive director. Ideally, you want to grow past that. But again, that person should be bringing very specific skills and experience to the table. And it should be exceptional. But when you have directors, and I've seen it, for example, I don't want to be too specific, but I've had that challenge with committees where the board establishes committees based on functional areas, and then, the creep is there, the separation is removed, and in effect, they wander into operational activities. So, no, directors should ideally just be directors. They should be given clear terms of references. They should be given some level of training in governance so they understand their role. And like I said, it's ready for the organization to have in place good systems for to ensure accountability.
Okay. All right. I have another question here from Glenda. It's asking, how do SMEs, or do SMEs rather, have a corporate social responsibility despite their size?
Of course, all entities have, whether they're companies, SMEs, or individual persons, have a social responsibility in one form or the other. Um, and for example, demonstrated, well, no, it's a legal requirement, but something like ensuring we help with the environment by not using plastic. So selecting the types of materials you use, you should focus now on green sustainability. You should focus on, if you can engage young graduates or young people generally in terms of internships to assist with their development. There are a number of roles in terms of corporate social responsibility that firms, large or small, should be engaged with. Recognizing that the operating environment comprises or is affected by a number of factors. So if we have environmental problems, that will ultimately affect your organization. If we have issues of youth unemployment or youth crime, etc., that will affect your organization. So it is in the best interest of all entities, to the extent that they can afford to engage in corporate social responsibility.
Okay. I have a few more questions now. They're coming a little more quickly. How does having a board demonstrate the longevity of a business when they're seeking funding for growth and expansion? Richard is asking this, and he's suggesting that they can easily be a challenge, especially when the principal primary executive members age from the standpoint of the funding entity's requirement for age. So how really does having a board demonstrate the longevity of a business when they're seeking funding for growth and expansion? And the second part of this, I gather, is that he's suggesting that, yeah, as we all know, that many times these boards are filled with persons who tend to be a lot senior, tend to be advanced in age. What are your thoughts?
The question or questions raise a number of issues. So I don't know that a board, the primary role should be to establish longevity of a business. It should lend to establishing that the business is properly structured and properly run. But I don't know that the role of the board is necessarily to demonstrate longevity of the business. Um, the question as to the age and this issue of um, the characteristics of board directors, it raises two primary issues for me. One is that of diversity, and there's a whole lot of work being done on the diversity of boards. Um, the question of most directors being older men, and the fact that having a more diverse board could or does improve decision making. So that the question touches on a whole other topic, diversity in terms of directors. Um, and I promote diverse boards. So, and attached to that is the question of the rotation of directors, right? So, in terms of the diversity of directors, you want, and attached also to the question of succession planning, you can benefit from having persons who have been around for a while, who have, relevant knowledge and experience. But in thinking to the future, you should be bringing in new blood. And by bringing in new blood, you also open the level, or you increase the level of innovation and thought on the board, because this thing of thinking outside of the box, moving away from the narrow perspective the board may have developed. So you should ideally have a good mixture. Again, with some organizations, especially members organizations, if you don't have the right systems in place, every time there's an election of a board of directors, you may end up with completely new people. And there are a number of disadvantages there, where they don't know the business, they don't have the experience, etc. So you want to have a good mix. And the issue of females on the board, um, this is not me saying so. There are a number of studies that have shown, women approach problem solving, etc., differently from men. And where there is a good mixture, there's evidence that there's better decision making. In terms of rotation, um, sometimes you see companies with directors who've been there forever. Not that all value is lost, but you have to think about change, about bringing in innovation, etc. So I certainly do not recommend that persons sit on boards of directors, for life. that you should have systems for rotation in place.
Yeah, I actually do support that. I hold some of these views, but I'm motivated to hear them coming now from someone else. A member of the um, institute, the Charter Governance Institute of Canada, myself, and accredited director, I hold strongly that A, you should have term limits for boards. B, you should always seek to have a diversified board as much as possible. And C, there should always be a separation between the policymakers and the operators. So the governors, those who govern and those who manage, should be separate as much as is practical. So the whole notion, for example, of having a chairman and CEO in one person, I personally believe is bad governance. It's not good governance at all. You should always have a separation because there must be a difference between who's policing
Yes, but
and the what is being policed.
yes, but when you're now starting out, you know, you're the chief cook and bottle washer. I accept that. Of course, as the organization, as I said, grows, you have
Mhm.
to move away from that.
Yes. So let's come back now because
So I
the
think we're
majority
on
of
the
our
same
audience
page.
is actually the small firm. So yes, the small firm wants to set up a board. So you put a board in place and you, the owner slash CEO, may very well in that initial few years serve as the chairman of that board so that you obviously can give it direction and so on. But as you grow, as the company grows, you may want to consider, shifting your role uh, and then hiring professional persons to actually manage the business. So here's another question from one of our participants. Is there a range for payment of salaries or payment rather to directors? How is this determined? What are your thoughts on the payment to the director?
I I have no issue with people being compensated for their time, but you have to know what you can actually afford. So my experience here in Barbados and actually in some of the other islands is that for small organizations, very small, there may be no fees. You may offer small stipends, for example, for travel, or you may offer, a meal or something like that. And then it can go up from there. But it depends on what the organization can afford.
Hmm. Yes.
So it will depend on the specific context.
Yeah. So it's really affordability to that member's affordability of the firm. So if it's a small business and you want to set up a board, say, of about a minimum of 3 persons to help with attracting the competencies you need to govern the board, to govern the company in that initial growth period, it is really based on your affordability, what you can afford to pay the director. What I would also add to that is that it would be good to scan the market as well and see what other boards are doing. What's the basic stipend or honoraria that you see other boards offer to their directors, and that you can use that as a guide too as you look at your own affordability. Here's another question um, from Glenda. Glenda is saying, look, SMEs usually focus on the business, as we know this, and tend to forget the regulatory requirements like filing and your returns and so on. So how would you address this matter? Because this is a part of governance as well.
Right. So when you are filing annual returns, it means that you're incorporated. Um, and what I would suggest, issue of having in place accounts, um, etc. You need to have, if not someone in the specific role of secretary, maybe you can engage an accountant. A lot of accountants will offer this. And I think the legislation, Glenda, you can correct me, but I think now there's a requirement to have to engage entities to file these certain returns and on your behalf. So I think there's I can't remember the name, but there's
Advisors.
legislation now there. Yeah. So you have to engage an advisor in that regard. And it brings, it's not just the regulatory requirements. Things like insurance, statutory deductions are paid, etc. What I didn't mention, and it's important, I mentioned how people are invited or elected to become directors, and usually they're very fussy, but being a director has legal implications, and directors can be held personally responsible for certain things. So you need to also be very, very aware of the legal implications of being a director. And these include where the company fails to file the returns, for example, and to make statutory payments and so on. So you can engage an advisor. If you set up a board of directors, you can consider having someone who's in the specific role of secretary, who would have the responsibility of ensuring that all of the filings, etc., are done.
Mhm. I quite agree. The
Or your
role of a
accountant
director
advice some of
has
those services.
certain legal ramifications, you know, and me you're liable for the payment of national insurance, etc., for the staff of the company. So you must know these things, and you must make sure that when you sit on that board, that there's proper reporting coming to you as a director that can satisfy you that the organization is meeting its statutory obligations because of your personal liability as a board. And you're right, relative to the filing, the advisors are only engaged where the company is making more than $1 million. So if you're not making over $1 million per year in revenue, you don't need to hire the advisor pursuant to the legislation. But it is always wise as a business to have at least someone. You're small, you can't afford, a lot of professionals, but at least one individual should be engaged, you know, should be a part of your management makeup that can help guide the organization in these areas. So I quite agree with you. Here's a question I see from Norma Shuri. She's asking, what is recommended in a case where a small company does not have an HR manager and staff are directed to report complaints and HR problems to the personnel committee of the board? What are your thoughts on that one?
It shouldn't happen. It should not happen. Remember, we spoke about the separation of responsibilities. And in fact, Dr. Holder mentioned the situation where you have, a director of finance, a director of HR, etc., on the board. Um, if you can have a board, it means you have at least should have a general manager, someone who's running the day-to-day organization. In the first instance, HR issues Issues concerning day-to-day operations should be going to the general manager or CEO. You do not want the board involved in the first instance in the operational activities. Now, you may have a system where there's review, or you have to go past first instance, so to speak. But the first recourse should be to the manager. And if the issue is not resolved, at that point, depending on the policies of the organization, the policies would dictate at what point the board would or should become involved in the matter. But you always have the operational activity directed to the manager.
Right. Very good. I quite agree with you. Operations should be kept at the operational level. And your board members and committees of the board can actually function as other tiers in the event that you know you have to go beyond the operational staff to provide any advice or guidance. But you're right, your general manager or CEO or managing director, whatever nomenclature is used, should be responsible for the day-to-day management of the business. So let's take the final question, Dr. Smith, at this time, because I know that we've exceeded our time by just a few minutes. So before my team start to leave, I have a question here. Is there a recommended number of directors? What positions do you think are absolutely necessary on that board?
I don't know. Especially with a small organization, there's a need to have a large number of directors. So you have really big companies that obviously will have a lot, or a relatively large number. But I would say for a small company, maybe 3 to 5, and you want an odd number. You want some system that allows, for good decisions, and when you think in terms of voting. But 3 to 5 persons, I think, is ideal. Um, I don't know you need to go anywhere beyond that. In terms of the roles, you have someone leading, so a chair. Um, and beyond that, I don't know. To My preference is to take the needs of the organization into consideration. As I said, try to reflect the competencies, the skills that the organization would most benefit from when you consider the directors. Let me look at the question again. So, right. So you don't want to have too many, so that becomes, convoluted, etc. You have a small organization with 20 employees. You don't need 20 directors. And in terms of the positions, someone to lead the board. But other than that, I would advise you to focus on the skill set they're bringing to the table. Don't worry about the titles so much.
Yeah, quite agree. I like that, about 3 to 5. And just let me reiterate for the member, please make sure that you have an odd number, because when you have voting, you want to make sure that there are no deadlock issues in the voting and the decision making and so on. And quite agree with you, Dr. Smith. Based on competencies, look at the needs of the firm. So that if your business, for example, is in finance, but you definitely need to have some sort of finance skill set on the board. But I like to encourage that as long as you have employees as well, If you have, you can try to get some person with an HR competency that will be able to give advice from an HR perspective, but you look at what your firm is doing and try to engage persons on the board that can help with that. If you're into cleaning, you may want to get some person with a business management competency on the board that can help with directing that and so on. So always remember, look at the business, what the business does, and try to attract competencies based on that. The only challenge though, Dr. Smith, is that this is all well and good when it comes to individual companies, but when it comes to membership associations, which you referred to earlier, it's very challenging sometimes to determine the skill sets there, and you may end up, with a board that don't have these competencies you need because of the democratic process in electing board members.
But I think but there's a need to educate members. Let people, or try to let them understand what is the role of a director, what are the needs of the organization, what are the legal responsibilities of a director. So just try to educate the member, where you're talking about a membership organization, try to educate them. This is not just so you have a nice title. This is a really serious responsibility, et cetera, et cetera. But before you wrap up, I think there was a question about, or maybe it's just I want to speak to it, but the criteria. Elvina Rollins asks, as it relates to boards and board members, is there a basic criteria for selecting board member apart from specific job-related competencies? What I would like to say is that you need to consider how your board reflects on the organization. So it's not only, as you said, about their competencies, but the board's help in the branding of the organization. So I have the personal experience where I would reach out to persons and ask, would you be interested in sitting on X board, blah, blah, blah. And the first question they ask is, who else is on the board? Who's on that board? Because they're thinking in terms of who will I be associating with, and how would it reflect on me? And people, clients, customers want to know who's on your board. Why? Because they want to know the level of person you have attracted. Are these people with good reputations? Very, very important. You have to have people who have sound reputation or are respected. They may not be celebrities, fine, but you want to ensure they have sound reputations and that they will add value to the organization. It makes no sense getting some because they're your cousin's brother or uncle and have them on your board. That was the last.
Yeah, thank you very much. Quite agree.
I wanted to make.
Quite agree. Don't just go for family members for the sake of filling the board. Mm-hmm. Always try to act in the interest of the organization. Matter of fact, those who've done any training in this understand that this is a perennial point. Always act in the interest of the organization. So if the organization needs to grow and develop and you're acting in its interest, you're going to make those decisions then that, you make sure that you hire, you employ the right kind of skill sets, you go after persons who can contribute to the growth and so on. And it's not just about friends and family, but you're acting in the interest of the organization. Okay, very good. Thank you very much, Dr. Smith, and thank you, colleagues, for your questions and your comments. We've been discussing today the fundamentals of good governance As I shared at the beginning, we did record our session, and in another couple of days, we'll add this to our library on the website in SBA TV. You can go back and view it in the event that you missed any segment of the program. Also, as I shared at the beginning, we're going to send you a short survey at the end of this that we're going to ask you please to, jot your thoughts down, give us some feedback as we seek to evaluate our session, and be reminded that this is the first of our series for 2021. We will be coming again as we've done in previous years. Every month, we will feature a topic of interest, a topic that we believe is of benefit to the small and medium enterprise sector here in Barbados and in the region, might I add. So use the opportunity as you give us your thoughts in the survey to suggest topics that are of importance to you as well as we seek to plan out the ensuing months for our webinar series. I want to thank you really for sharing your day with us. And as I close, please also be reminded that in this COVID environment, especially as Barbados is getting ready for a lockdown come February 3rd, please be safe. Please be safe. As I began the session today, I'll conclude by letting you know that we will continue as an association to solicit your views through our research and our polling mechanism, and we will use this information to strengthen our lobbying. As we did back in March, April, when we had the first lockdown, we lobbied the governmental officials for support, financial support, moratorium on payment of rents, and so on for our members. We will continue to do so in the next few weeks. We've already started actually to have those discussions to try to make sure that our small firms can access monetary resources at this time to help still with the payment of operational costs as we go into this lockdown. So please draw on the support of your association as a member during the next few weeks as we seek to work together in this pandemic, during this pandemic, to make sure that our businesses are kept afloat and kept alive. It has been my pleasure being your host today. Let me thank Dr. Erica Smith. She's the Executive Director of Intellectual Management Services, but you also know her as the CEO of CostGap. She is a very popular individual relative to the arts, intellectual property, and so on. So Dr. Smith, thank you very much for sharing with us today. And we look forward to another session. And please stay tuned as we let you know what our plans are for the month of February and beyond. Thank you once again. God bless you all, and do continue to enjoy your day. Bye-bye now.